Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I'm Jay Lux with FCC Services. We're really looking forward to our conversation this afternoon. And the topic at hand is versatility in the leadership role and leadership capacity. I hope you can all hear okay and can see the our presentation and slide deck as we go through this. If there's any problems, you can shoot a quick Q&A message and we'll make sure everything's working well. But from our testing, it appears we should be in good shape. We're excited about the conversation for a number of reasons. We've got three wonderful guests and presenters that we're going to introduce in just a moment. But a couple of things that sort of got us to where we are today. You know, as we look over the last 7 or 8 weeks, it's been pretty chaotic and pretty challenging. And one of the things that we know is challenging as it can be, that chaos can really provide some wonderful leadership opportunities. For many of you that have been around the Farm Credit Organization for a number of years, I wasn't at the time, but I've heard the comment, wow, you should have been here in the 80s, or what we learned in the 80s. And we think back to that chaotic time in our farm credit systems past and the lessons that were learned. And often those come up in the context of, those are the things that helped build me into the leader that I am today. And so we wanted to pause our busy daily schedule for a little while and have a conversation about that. And how we can seize the opportunity and capitalize on that. And I really believe 10 years from now or 20 years from now, people are going to say, boy, you should have been here in 2020, or the things that I learned in 2020 really queued me up to be the leader that I am today. And so it's important that we thought it important and an opportunity for us to take a little bit of time. As we talk about how do we capitalize and seize on that opportunity, we'll talk a little bit about our own individual tendencies and kind of the people that we are, the person that comes to work every day, and how those tendencies can help me as I maximize leading through a chaotic time. And sometimes those traits can hinder me a little bit, right? They can help me be less versatile. And then we'll close up talking about some of the behavioral aspects, the things that we can change. Our tendencies can fluctuate, but we can also adjust our behaviors to be a little more effective and exhibit a little more versatility as well. We also want to make sure that we're hearing from you. So as we go through our conversation today, you know, in a perfect world, we'd all be sitting together in the same room, maybe, you know, nice comfy chairs, or a conference room at a hotel. Everybody'd have a fresh cup of coffee and we could have a conversation together, right? But it's not necessarily a perfect world right now, so we're making the best use of technology that we can to facilitate the conversation. So a couple things we might ask of you is, as we go through this, use the chat box or the Q&A box in your Zoom software to submit questions for us. And we've dedicated time at the end to try and field as many of those as we have time for. So rather than stopping throughout our discussion, send those in. We'll queue them up at the end, and we'll spend a few minutes with your questions. If possible, I would ask, please try and, or if you have a desire to direct your question to one of our three panelists, please do so. And again, we'll dedicate time at the end to facilitating some discussion around those questions. So let me take for just a moment, first of all, the opportunity to thank our presenters, our three guests, and our subject matter experts, and give a bit of an introduction. Three really great partners that we have on our for the next hour with us today. Many of you, of course, know Bill Johnson. Bill is the president CEO of Farm Credit Mid-America in Louisville, Kentucky. They serve over 85,000 customers in Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Bill's got over 35 years of financial services experience, as well as experience in the farm credit system. He's held leadership roles across the farm credit system, from the Northeast to the Pacific Northwest, to the Midwest, whether it's been at the system bank level or associations level. He's got a really rich and deep background. Bill also currently serves as the chair of the Farm Credit System's President's Planning Committee. Also, nice to know, we're fortunate that Bill Johnson is also on the board of FCC Services, so we get to use his experience and intellect in our organization as well. And not only has Bill been an active servant of Farm Credit, he's also an active servant of his communities, and he's held board positions and community service positions on the board of the Indianapolis-based Agri-Novus, Indiana. He's also on the board of trustees at the University of Evansville, and has worked with other organizations in an advisory and a speaking role. Bill's got a bachelor's degree in finance from the University of Evansville, He's got a master's degree from Gonzaga University. He also, Bill's really putting his money where his mouth is when he talks about executive growth and development. He's finishing the pursuit of his doctoral degree from Vanderbilt University. And so we're pleased to have Bill with us. He's been a great partner and a good friend of the Farm Credit System and FCC Services, as well as all of us. Also, Paul Connolly, another great partner of ours. Dr. Connolly founded Performance Programs, Inc. in 1987 to serve clients in the areas of workplace surveys, personality assessments, executive assessments. Many of you have worked with instruments like the Hogan assessments, and Paul is instrumental in the development and the use and interpretation of those. His organization, in his experience, he's done organizational measurement, strategic design, questionnaire and survey development, 360 tools, et cetera, across the board for organizations globally and here across the US. He's authored and co-authored 7 books and numerous articles. Paul's a licensed psychologist, member of the Association for Psychological Science and the Society of Industrial and Organizational Psychology. He's a graduate of Holy Cross College and Fordham University, where he got his master's and his PhD. Our third guest is Rob Kaiser, and Rob is an advisor, author, and internationally recognized expert on leadership. He began his career with the Center for Creative Leadership. He became a partner in the executive development firm Kaplan DeVries, and has decades of experience of coaching executives, team building and team effectiveness, working with multinational organizations to enhance performance at the individual as well as the organizational level. He's been widely published in research journals like the Harvard Business Review, and he's well thought of as an expert in the area. Paul's got a master's degree in psychology from Illinois State University, and was recognized with their Career Achievement Award at Illinois State. He's a fellow at the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology and received the Scientist Practitioner Presidential Recognition Award and such. So you can see 3 really robust sets of expertise to spend some time with us today. And with that, if we were together, I would open it to applause. Maybe we'll do that quietly, but a big thank you to our guests. And if it's okay, I'm gonna click forward and turn it over to Mr. Johnson. Bill and gentlemen, thanks for your partnership on our call today.
Thank you, Jay, for getting us started. And as we look at this, we're going to cover kind of a broad perspective on things. But Jay talked about the 80s. And sometimes in our organization, when we talk about the 80s, we start to get the eye rolls start to happen of the olden times, as my daughter calls it. But we've had, at that point in time, those of us who were working, we had the ability to learn very quickly in the heat of the crisis out of necessity. And so we were doing things far beyond what we were experienced and able to do just to keep our customers served and to go forward. Some of us were around for Y2K, when we thought the world would shut down when the year 2000 came, and we worked through that. And during that, we learned some things about our systems and actually made changes that made our business better. And so again, out of necessity, we continued to get better and doing the things we did. We worked through the financial crisis of 2008, and now we find ourselves in the middle of the pandemic. And so when you think in terms of leaders and the important things that we can do today, and leaders can be at any point in the organization, and they don't have to have the title, obviously, to be a leader. But the importance of making personal connections. And it's been interesting. We've been doing calls to our regional offices and departments, the senior team, over the last couple of weeks, just to, again, check in with folks. And the thing that is pretty incredible right now is the fact that our communication has actually increased, even though about 85% of the company is working remote. And people comment about how much they appreciate connecting with their leader, connecting with their work team, even though it's virtual. But the importance of seeing and hearing from leaders on a regular basis is really, when you think about that, right now, people are trying to make sense of this situation. We're uncertain when it's going to go to the next phase. There's a lot of uncertainty about work. Luckily, with Farm Credit, we're in a financial condition where folks aren't worried about their jobs per se, but they're worried about their customers, their coworkers, the health, the well-being of the organization, but trying to make sense of that. And so in uncertainty, uncertainty triggers stress. And so the things we can do to help our teams through that is, one is to share the facts. Say what you know and what you don't know. It's really important to dispel rumors. And so, for example, in our organization, we had a few groups that thought, things are really bad. People are getting laid off. Does that mean Farm Credit's going to do that? And so we've had some very specific talks about our financial strength as an organization and the fact that we have no plans to let people go. In fact, we don't have enough people to get the job done today. And so as we think about that, it's also setting priorities, making sure that we're very clear. And so that creating clarity to make sure what's the most important thing to do in a particular day. And it might seem simple, but things like performance objectives for the year, things are different. And we may not get to every project. We may not get to every initiative. And folks need to know, are we going to change those expectations? What are those expectations that we have on a daily basis? Because really, when you think about leadership, it's coming back to creating clarity with the team so that we're all focused and heading in the same direction and going forward. The other thing is, we think about a crisis is a great opportunity to really share the load. And so as you think back to previous crises, I was extremely lucky in where I've been in Farm Credit to have leaders who were willing to let me make some mistakes and share the burden in completing work. I may not have understood or really been qualified, but they stood beside me and allowed me to tackle some new things about the job, but also to share their work. And so it's a great opportunity for younger leaders to take on more role. It's a great opportunity for a leader to setting up a webinar to say, who wants to organize the next webinar? It doesn't always have to be the leader. And it's a great way to learn. It's a great development opportunity as you look for that. Again, as you think about small wins and teaching through a crisis, talking, when you're making decisions as a leader, involving the team, but talking through how you're coming to a decision. And so that thinking out loud is also a great way to teach. And there's so many things that's coming up right now that those opportunities present themselves every day in one way or another. And so it may feel like you're going slower, but when you think in terms of thinking about this crisis as an opportunity for development and really growth within your team, it's really providing tons of opportunity right now. And that may be a twisted way to look at things, but I think it's important that we look at those opportunities and think about where each person on your team is at. And are there ways to use this as an opportunity for growth and to help get the work done? Which really leads us then to the next topic that we have shared with our leaders. We re-shared it again this week, but it's to take care of yourself. And so when you think about right now, and someone said the other day, it's really nice working from home, but being that close to the refrigerator is pretty hard to walk by it from time to time. And I would tell you, I have gained a few pounds and I've let my exercising slip a little. And that tends to also impact sleep. And as you're going to hear from our other two speakers, our own personal care is really important now as it relates to how we show up as leaders. And so a phrase that the Harvard Business School uses just so that we can kind of get a visual picture is put your oxygen mask on first. And so when we return to flying again one of these days, you're going to hear that every flight. Well, that's so that you don't pass out before you can help your kids. And so as a leader, that self-care and making sure that you're doing what you need to do, which includes taking a few days off from time to time, getting away from things, decompressing, those are all part of self-care that will lead to better leadership. And it may seem counterintuitive, but at this point in time, we're probably all working more hours. We're working while we used to commute. We're working while we used to do client dinners. We're doing those things on a regular basis. It is going to it'll have the wear and tear on us, both mentally and physically, is going to start showing up in different ways. And I think our next two speakers are going to be able to guide us through how we think about how we show up and react to certain situations. And let there be no doubt, people look to leaders not only from a sense-making standpoint, but also modeling the behavior that's expected in an organization. And so if we're not at our best, it's hard for us to model our best. And so with that, I think Paul is ready to take us into how we're kind of wired as individuals.
Yeah, thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Bill.
Jay, you can move to the next slide.
Thank you, Paul.
So psychologists spend a lot of time looking at ways of assessing people and hopefully being able to predict how people perform and how they're going to react. And so there are lots of those measures that we use, but today we thought we'd focus on two of them. The first one that I'm going to talk about are basically how to look at tendencies, how you're wired, basically how you're different from other people. And then Rob is going to take a look at behavior, and behavior is a product of all sorts of things, not only just tendencies, but also drives, how smart you are, what you've learned, and all the rest. And so Rob is a specialist in the area of assessments of behavior. And between those two, we're hoping to give you some insights into your own reactions as leaders and how that might impact how you're viewed by others. Next one. So this chart shows the categories of typically how people, our psychologists describe how people are different. And in the middle column there, it's the lower scores description. On the right-hand column there, it's the higher scores description. This is how you show up basically 90% of the time, or 99% of the time. And people are going to differ on these various characteristics. And there's not good or bad characteristics necessarily until you say, here's a job. And then there are characteristics that are, or tendencies that are more predispose you to having a successful outcome with that than others. But one thing we continually say is just we can understand tendency, and nobody's built right out of the gate typically to be a perfect person who could do a certain job. So most of us have to shape ourselves with some behaviors that maybe are a little bit different than our usual tendencies in order to make us be successful. But the categories are in this area, basically the first one is resilience, and the lower scoring people tend to, you know, if you scratch them, they tend to react pretty quick. You think of your entrepreneurial types, these sales types are in this category. Whereas the higher scores tend to be more composed and stress tolerant. You can think of many pilots. You can hear the calm in their voice, even though there may be a stressful situation going on. So that's one way people differ. People also differ in terms of how directed they are, how competitive they are. Some people are quite cooperative and very team focused. Others are quite competitive and very assertive. In social styles, you know, many people are introverted and are focused and quiet and task focused, and many others are outgoing and very talkative. Right now, with this particular situation of being distanced from others, introverts are finding it a little more comfortable, extroverts finding it a little more difficult. So I'm finding it comfortable. So it's hard for many people to do, however. Communication style, there are those, you have friends who will tell you exactly what they think very quickly. And then there are those who are more diplomatic and tactful and friendly. Task focus, there are those who are quite flexible and bring creative ideas to the situation. There are others who say, no, this is the procedure and this is how it should be done. In problem solving, you have people who are very pragmatic and very tactical versus people who are big picture and strategic. You see in this one, people who have operations type experience often get rewarded in their early career for being very pragmatic and tactical because they get stuff out the door, and may struggle a bit when they move into leadership positions because it wants them to look more strategically and think more steps out than they're used to or tend to do. And the other, sometimes you have people who struggle with those operational roles who hit the leadership world and all of a sudden everything is working beautifully because they can take advantage of that tendency to think big picture. And that job takes more of that into account. And then finally, learning style. We look at people who like to learn as they need to, just in time, if you will. And then those who are more traditional learners who are going to be looking for any opportunity to learn and often will prefer formal learning kind of situations. So these are ways people differ. We all have ups and downs, and being lower or higher is not good or bad. Again, it's just how we're different. Although as you get towards the extremes on these things, very low scores or very, very high scores, you start to get both blessings and curses. Too much of a good thing is what you want to watch out for. So that's the usual tendencies, and that's how you show up most of the time. The other thing we look at, and we thought we would do on this session, is to look at how you're wired, but how you're wired when things hit the fan, when basically there's a lot of stress or a lot of fatigue, which could easily be what the case is now. And this is a presentation of how things can happen from going from a strength to overuse of a strength. And so there are three big categories of things that we look at. When people are stressed or fatigued, there's kind of three general reactions. One is to run away. We call it flight. And the first five that we're showing here have to do with different flavors of running away or getting away. The second category has to do with fight. And these are people who engage the problem. And so these people come at you. And there are four flavors of that. And then there are two flavors of what we call need to be right. And these are kind of the clingy reactions. And we'll get into those as well. All of us have these. Most people have two or three. Some people have more. More or fewer is not necessarily better or worse. Again, the thing these all have in common is when they become explosive, or when they get very strong, which is typically under stress or fatigue, at that point where you have had just enough and your shoulders shrug, and you say, you know what, I don't care anymore. That's the moment that these come out. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. And when they come out, they tend to damage the relationships with other people. And these are also, sometimes these are called ghosts, because these are the kind of things that people remember because they're so dramatic that they can follow you throughout a career, because you have a reputation for something that was very memorable. So just take a quick look, and those of you who did the little self-assessment will recognize that these fit back cleanly into that self-assessment that you took if you took it online. The first one has to do with explosiveness. And so this is where people who are on the positive sense are very intense and energetic, but really it goes a little too far and they start to be seen as moody and really unpredictable. What kind of day is Paul having? Let's not talk to him today, right? If I'm on the moody side. Skepticism, and this one, by the way, the people who did answer, 25% of you had checked that one as a possibility. The second category is skeptical, and it goes from being shrewd and careful and really asking good questions to overkill, where there isn't any amount of information that's going to be seen as persuasive. That was the second highest of this particular group. We had 44% of you who indicated that might be a tendency that would be overused for you. Cautious has to do with being very careful, and that's good, especially in banking, of course, but to the point where it becomes a problem when no amount of information or no amount of meetings or no amount of anything is going to convince you to move forward. It's an extreme fear of failure. That was shared by 29% of the folks who answered. Reserved has to do with being very task-focused and objective, and typically introverts are on this particular side of things, and they're therefore at risk when becoming stressed or fatigued to really withdraw and become uncommunicative. And in fact, this was 54% was the highest that this group checked off. This was a tendency. We used to associate animals with these scales, and the animal that was associated here was the turtle. So it's withdraw into the shell. The next one, passive aggressive, has to do with being cooperative and agreeable. But the issue is when stressed or fatigued, people who are passive aggressive will grin and say yes, while internally saying never going to happen. And so it's that passive aggressive situation. And that was shared by 38% of the group. The thing those all have in common is they're ways to distance you from others. So reserved is me pulling away. Skeptical is people want to run away. Volatile people want to run away. But basically the strategy is get away from me. The next category has to do with engaging others, and that's the fight category. Bold is being really confident and assertive, but taken way too far when under stress or fatigue, and saying things that you come across as arrogant and really smug. This one was 21% of the population had that. That's a fairly common one, by the way, with executive populations in general, because it comes with a high confidence. And so it's more of too much of a good thing. Mischievous is next. This is often people who are low in rules, can be playful, and it may come across as charming and interesting at one point, but it can cross the line and really become way too risky in limit testing. This one was not too much common in your group. 10% in this of the group answered that was a possibility. Colorful, being melodramatic, being very outgoing and animated, but when going into stress mode, you know, calling meetings, having very dramatic things happen, really seeking attention. This was the lowest of the reactions from this group at 6%. And eccentric, this is basically innovative and creative is the positive piece, but crossing the line and becoming just wacky and eccentric and impractical. Just 8% of the population that we were, of you folks who answered indicated that was a possibility. But all of these have in common is they force you to interact with the person who's under stress. You can't escape it. You're being part of an audience, you're being forced to listen to wacky ideas, we're being the recipient of a lot of confidence, overconfidence. The last category has to do with the need to be right. The first one here is the micromanager. So the strength is very detailed, hardworking, but the issue that can happen is becoming very perfectionistic and demanding. This was third highest at 40% for this group. And then finally, the pleaser. This is the yes person, very supportive and loyal as the everyday strength. However, it can really cross over and be ingratiating and deferential and really just trying to do, what do I do next, boss kind of stuff. And that was 21% of the pop of this group indicated that one. So the three highest were the reserved at 54, the skeptical at 44, and the micromanaging at 40. Those are the three. Okay, next slide. So we gave you the opportunity, and you can take advantage of this after this session as well at the website below. We wanted to do three things. We wanted to see how much impact are you under, and based on how you answered that question, we assigned some points to that, ranging from, you know, really hasn't affected me at all to, you know, real close, very severe impact. The average for this group was 28 points, which indicates that most people, 68% of you scored between 12 and 45. So that suggests, you know, there's some changes going on, but across the whole group, you're basically coping. And people who are closer to 45 are having a little more difficulty. Next, second step, so that's the impact of current events on you. The second step, we tried to go back and give you, have you do a self-assessment basically on that resilience usual tendency. And essentially, people who don't take a lot of scratching to get a reaction, they're the people who are on the upside, they're passionate, they're entrepreneurial, they tend to get things happening really quickly, but they also tend to be the people who react a lot quicker when things are stressful or under great fatigue. And so we tried to give you a self-assessment on that to assess how scratchy are you. And we had, on average, it was 65% of you in the 50-point range, 21 in the 0-point range, and 13 in the higher range. Okay, next slide. So we had that as step 2. Step 3 was where we asked you to check the descriptions that kind of described you. I will say that self-assessments are notoriously difficult to use and to make predictions on. One way, if you wanted to get more accurate about this, is to ask somebody to complete section 3 who knows you really, really well, because they may check off different boxes or more than you may have checked off. So when you did that, you pressed enter, and you got a little summary of your results. Go to the next slide, Jay. It looks something like this. The average for this group was 104. So in the moderate and the low risk actually range for the average, but people's scores ranged, 68% of you ranged within 62 to 146. So, you know, these are linked together. Basically, it's saying there's a moderate, low to moderate amount of stress in your lives and watching out for that. We say in our work, we always say assessment leads to awareness, and then awareness has to move to action. And that action is the piece where Rob focuses his work. We are looking at predicting based on tendency, but then you have to do something with that. You can't just say, oh, it's okay for me not to go to the meeting because I'm introverted. No, it's not okay. You have to make an adaptation, I'm afraid, to do something. And then so finally, just to summarize the takeaways, be aware of your tendencies because that's usually how you show up, and be aware of the ways you may react when under stress. I actually have gotten good at recognizing one of my derailers, which is mischievous. I actually hear myself saying something mischievous before I actually recognize I'm under stress. So I can have that opportunity now to avoid the bad things happening when that showed up for me before, which was getting fired 2 different times. To avoid that, I stopped doing that because I recognize the behavior before I actually recognize the emotion. And that's what you're trying to get at in terms of controlling things. So monitor yourself to avoid overreacting, especially during stressful times. And know that tendency isn't destiny. You can choose to behave differently. It takes motivation, and it takes awareness, and it takes work, but it can be done. There are no traits that we've mentioned here or tendencies that you can't adapt and move and have successful outcomes and performance. So that's my bit. Off to you, Rob.
Thanks, Paul. It's really helpful as we think of, again, ourselves and how we manage those natural biases. And I think it's an important reminder for us to think, these are not 100% all the time. They're biases. So if I tend to have a bias of being a pretty confident person, that's kind of going to be the way it is. There are times where I might lose a little confidence. So those are the biases. And now we'll shift gears and Paul will talk us through then the behavioral aspects and the behavioral implications of this. So thanks, Paul. Rob, we'll switch gears to you if that's okay.
That sounds great. Thanks for organizing this, Jay, and also thanks for the great setup, Paul and Bill. So they say adversity reveals character, and it doesn't get much more adverse than these trying times. I'm reminded of that quote from Warren Buffett: "When the tide goes out, we discover who's been swimming naked." A lot of the executives I've been talking to in the last couple of months are telling me that they feel totally exposed right now. Everyone's trying to make sense of what's going on, and they're looking to their leaders for answers. One lesson I've learned assessing and coaching hundreds of executives is that Paul is right. Personality is not destiny. While you may not be able to change how you're wired, with self-awareness, a couple strategies and tactics like Paul described, you can reprogram your behavior. In addition to coaching leaders, I've also been studying them and their development for about 20 years. There's one quality that the great ones seem to have in common. They're versatile. They have a range of opposing but complementary behaviors. They can zoom out, see the big picture, take the long view, then zoom in on the tactical details of execution. They can step up and make decisions, especially the hard choices and tough calls on people issues. They can also step back and empower their people, get their input on key decisions, and support and develop them with compassion and real caring. It's this broader perspective and wider range of behaviors that enable versatile leaders to read and respond to change as they guide their teams through disruptive jolts and shocks. We've devised a way to measure versatility, in terms of Paul's categories, it's a behavioral measure as opposed to a personality assessment. It's what you actually do as opposed to what you're likely to do, sort of thing. We find this behavioral measure of versatility correlates with every positive outcome of leadership: employee engagement, turnover, team cohesion and adaptability, and organizational resilience and productivity. Go on down the line. And it turns out that versatility plays an even more decisive role in uncertain, complex times. When we started this work in the late 90s, versatility could statistically account for about a third of leadership effectiveness. Well, data over the last decade show it to count for half of effectiveness. As the world has gotten more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, VUCA as they say, versatility has become even more important. It doesn't get any more VUCA than today. Here's the thing about the most effective versatile leaders I've known and studied. None of them were born that way. They evolved into it over a career of diverse and challenging assignments, getting stretched out of their comfort zones and having to adapt on the fly by learning new skills, perspectives, and behaviors. And another interesting thing, the truly versatile leaders we've examined don't have a distinct personality type. We've seen introverts learn to reach out, build bridges, and figure out how to communicate an inspiring message. We've also seen flaming extroverts learn to have a less jarring impact and resist the urge to speak up first and become better listeners. Creative, big picture thinkers have learned to be more patient with the details and appreciate structure and operational discipline. Great operators who run things by the book, they learn to step back, think more flexibly about where we're going, and sometimes break from tradition and choose a better way to get there. What these versatile leaders do have in common is an ability to learn from hardship, failure, and feedback. It's just like Bill said, crisis creates an opportunity for growth. The executives I have seen grown into more versatile leaders also know themselves, their strengths and their weaknesses. Early in a career, they make a name for themselves with those natural born strengths. I call it their superpowers. But at some point, a strength can become a weakness when you rely on it like a crutch and fail to learn a complementary set of skills and behaviors. One of my clients said, I get it. I don't have to give up my fastball. I just don't have to throw it every time. And by working up some managerial off-speed pitches, it made his fastball even more effective. So it's like Paul was saying, I think Bill mentioned this too, the human tendency under pressure is to react, maybe even overreact with what you're good at. You just fall back on what you know, how you're wired. And that's exactly a recipe for turning a superpower into a weakness through overuse. So the first step in leading with greater versatility in these challenging times is to manage your own stress. Commonly overlooked part of this is managing your energy. It takes energy to manage yourself and choose intentionally to respond with a more constructive behavioral choice. Whether that be titrating the dosage on how much of a strength you apply, or sometimes going against the grain with a different behavior altogether, one that may not come quite so naturally. It starts with sleep, exercise, and a healthy diet. All the stuff we know we should do to take care of ourselves, like Bill had pointed out. It's also about being careful with alcohol and eating convenient but maybe unhealthy food. These are the basics. All the stuff our parents told us, our mother told us probably, she told me when I was growing up. We know this, it's easier said than done though, but they're table stakes. You also have to recharge periodically. We know from Jim Lair's work with world-class athletes like tennis champ Steffi Graf and gold medal speed skater Dan Jansen that going all out is not what kills you. It's not taking a break to recharge that does you in. Jim's talked about this expend and recovery cycle as the key to maintaining your energy and stamina so you can be at your best when your organization most needs you to be. So a couple tips. Be sure to catch a break between periods of intensity. Don't schedule meetings back to back and running breathlessly from one to the next. Build in a break. Schedule a lighter morning after a draining day. Unplug in the evening when you go home. Change things up with fun time with your family, perhaps. You have to allow your superpowers to recharge so they're ready to go when you need them. There's another simple trick I learned from Andy Walsh. He runs Red Bull's High Performance Center, where they train extreme sports athletes like Formula One racers, motorcycle jumpers, cliff divers, and that guy who did the space jump by parachuting from the outer reaches of the atmosphere a couple of years ago. And he teaches these extreme athletes what he calls the 4x4x4 deep breathing technique. And he and I help Red Bull's corporate leaders use this to elevate their performance as well. It's pretty simple. Here's what you do. Clear your mind, shut out distractions, and then take a long, slow, deep 4-second inhale through your nose. Hold it for 4 seconds, and then let it out slowly through your mouth for 4 seconds. Do this about 20 times and focus on the physical sensation of your lungs filling and releasing. Right before an important call or a discussion, it can get you relaxed. And if you do it 4 minutes, 4 times a day, there's actual good research, biomedical research, that shows it can rewire your brain to be more resilient. It lowers the stress hormone cortisol and increases your ability to stay calm and flexible under pressure. Of course, that reduces the chances of you overreacting. Now, you're also going to need a dual perspective mindset to avoid the trap of overdoing what comes natural and free you up to choose alternative, perhaps better ways of responding to the challenge in front of you. It's like risk and reward. You'd never do a deal without considering the upside and the downside of alternative scenarios. So before leaping into action, use that power of the pause to consider your response options. Simple trick for checking your biases and blind spots is to think yin and yang. What's another good way I could handle this? Maybe your superpower. May also be an opposing but better suited technique. So to give you an idea how to do this, consider for a minute, are you more oriented to people and relationships, or getting down to business on tasks and getting stuff done? For on Paul's assessment that you did, if you scored higher on pleaser or passive aggressive, you're probably more people oriented. If you scored higher on reserved or micromanager, you're probably more task focused. So for both tendencies, I want to give you some tips that I've actually used with my executive clients, and they found useful as they try to lead and find their way through the pandemic. So look, if you're more of a taskmaster, like Bill said, it's really important that we stay connected to our people in these trying times, but remember to check in before you check on. So we want to start with a little bit of a personal connection. It can be as simple as the question, hey, how are you doing? And then really carefully listening to what they have to say and what the emotional tone is beyond that. If you want to take this deeper, you don't want to constantly just do the same thing. Hey, how you doing? You can form an even more personal connection with folks when you're warming up. With some of these examples I'll share with you that we've come up with some of my clients. One, hey, what surprising thing have you been stocking up on besides toilet paper? What part of your shelter-in-place residence do you most appreciate? Or here's a really good one that I've been using. Now, what's the last thing that really made you laugh? Take that moment to sync up, sink in, and tune into each other before you get down to business. Now, when it comes time to making decisions, I know we're all working remotely, we're not together, it's not quite as easy to bounce ideas around. So remember to run a quick screen. Ask yourself, do I have all the input I need? Should I consult anyone who may be affected by this? Sometimes going slow to go fast is the best way to get those decisions accepted and implemented. And look, it's a tough time for everyone. And sometimes you have to provide bad news. Before you do that, though, give yourself a moment to think about timing and how to create the conditions and the tone so that the person and the people can really hear the message and not get hung up in how it's delivered. You've got to prepare them to hear what's coming. And here's a really interesting one. I found a couple of my clients have actually put a little printout of a couplet from the poet laureate Maya Angelou to remind them that when this is all over, people will forget what you said and they'll forget what you did, but they will always remember how you made them feel. So look, if you're more of a people person, we got another set of tips here. You know, as you're checking in, before the call or the video chat, remind yourself to limit the amount of personal socializing and catching up, to make sure you have ample time for the business matters. One leader I worked with found it really helpful to come up with sort of a stock phrase to have at the ready. As she goes through the personal connection, that check-in before she checks on, she had a phrase, "I'm really glad to know you're doing well. Can we switch gears and talk about," and that was a nice little cue or prompt to help her remember, as much as an empathetic, caring person she is, she's got to at some point pivot to the work at hand. Also, when it comes time to making decisions, the tendency for people is to pull everyone together, talk through it, have a participative process. It's useful to have a structure for limiting the discussion and making the call. For instance, give people and announce that, hey, we're going to take 10 minutes, 15 minutes, what have you, to talk about our position on this matter and share our ideas. And then when it's time, you've covered the ground, call time. If you've gotten to a point where you can make the decision, as the leader, it's your prerogative. Sum up the points, state your position, make the call. Not always possible. Don't let that meeting, that hour-long meeting, run into a 90-minute-long meeting where everybody's airing their piece. Call time at the end of the meeting and say, look, I'm going to need to, we're at the top of the hour. I'm going to need to think about this, and I'll get back to you with my decision, or if it's that we have to re-engage in some sort of a way. Also, be careful about softening tough news. The news is what the news is, but people appreciate a straightforward, candid, and clear message that doesn't sugarcoat or minimize things. They also like to hear the rationale and thinking behind it. It might be a tough pill to swallow, but it's a lot easier to take the straight stuff than it is sort of the ambiguous message that's tried to be minimized and spun into a more positive way than the reality merits. I'll also give you this quote from Eli Broad. He founded 2 Fortune 500 companies, started them up from scratch, KB Home, Sun America. He also, after he made his fortune, he became an amazing public education philanthropist. Eli Broad said, "I would rather be respected than popular." Leadership is not a popularity contest. It's not always about being liked. Your position sometimes requires you to make the tough calls that's necessary for the greater good and the mission. It might not feel good at the time. Remember Eli Broad. So look, there are plenty of paradoxical challenges and competing priorities you have to juggle right now. Concern for people's health, economic health, surviving in the short term and coming out strong for the long term, and so on. Our work suggests that managing your energy, knowing your strengths, and pausing with that dual perspective to consider both yin and yang will help you get through this by making the most of your superpowers without overdoing it. And that's the trick versatile leaders that I've seen have learned. They use their strengths selectively in the right situation at the right time to the right degree, and recognize when that doesn't come naturally, sometimes might actually be the better approach. Might not be perfect, doesn't have to be perfect. No one ever is. But consider giving the other approach a try. A regular practice of this will expand your range, make you more broadly capable, and help you become a more versatile version of yourself. The numbers show that this can increase your effectiveness and ability to lead your people, teams, and customers through this crisis and the next one. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob. And Paul and Bill, excellent points. We've got some time built in to go to some questions. So if I can, just one moment. So here's our first question, and I'll let any one of you, it's not directed to anyone in particular. So how does the right play, how does the right play in on the fight or flight response? So I think that's the quote, how does it, the being right, the need to be right, and maybe Paul, you want to field this one first. So remember those three components when under stress: fight, flight, or the need to be right. How does the right play in on the fight or flight response?
Micromanager is the right, needing to be right because I have a very specific way I want to do things. It has to be done this way, so exactly like this. And being right on the person who's the pleaser is yes, what can I do next? Yes, what can I do next? So I can't do anything wrong because I'm doing exactly what you said, if that answers the question. I think that was it.
Got it, thanks. And it doesn't circumvent, if I understand you, Paul, it doesn't circumvent the need for a right answer or to be accurate, but sort of the security blanket of always having the right answer.
Right, and that's the risk.
Okay, thanks. Our question asker responded. That was helpful. Let me just look and see any other questions. I'm going to give it just a moment for the group to chime in on questions. And while they do, I'm going to ask a question if it's okay. And Bill, you talked about sort of the opportunities to, that crisis can create for us to, for lack of a better term, delegate things, but to involve people in other things. Sometimes our natural predisposition is to hunker down and want to sort of control things. What's been your observation on how do you sort of find moment for pause, or how do we do that? Any thoughts or advice, counsel, on that, Bill?
Well, Rob's breathing technique actually works really good in that situation too, so you don't just react.
Yeah.
Let me rephrase that. Many people ended up in leadership roles because they were really good individual contributors. And they built their career on the ability, they had the knowledge and the capabilities to get the job done. And making that transition to a leader role is those two are very different. And so thinking in terms of how does the team get it done? And sometimes you just have to stop and think about what you're doing. And it's that balance between making a quick decision because it truly is an emergency, and taking the time because it isn't an emergency. It's still important, it still needs to move forward, but you don't have to make that decision in the next 5 minutes or do it yourself. And so it may take just a little longer at the beginning and as you go through that. So I think right now it would be, and Rob would probably have some perspective on this, I think that's a vulnerability we have, those of us that are working hard to avoid that trap. But because of this current situation, I think we feel more pressure. I don't know, Rob, if you have a perspective on that.
I'm very consistent with what you're saying, Bill.
We had a question, I think it was very similar, but it was directed towards Bill or the whole group. But, talk about sharing the leadership load when that wasn't your natural instinct, was to kind of do it on your own. And you may have hit that one, but anything else to add, or any of the other gentlemen?
Well, the one thing I would put out there is sort of a mindset change. My friend that does this kind of work talks about a behavioral addiction. And what he means by that is earlier in our career, we got the drive, we got the technical skills, we're reliable, get stuff done, we get the praise, we get the raise, we get the promotion. And it becomes a real sense of self-esteem and feeling good about ourselves, not to mention advancing our career. But like Bill's saying, when you elevate your play to a leadership role, the name of the game is not what you know and can do. The name of the game is how can you inspire, motivate, and bring together people who know and can do all sorts of different things. Some of them probably can't do it as well as you can. And that's frustrating, and the temptation is to dive in with what you know. But the great leaders understand that there's a learning process just like they went through. They provide the guide rails where they have expertise, but they coach and guide their people and give them the space to give it a chance as well to do that type of work and grow into the leader they can be. You can't know it all. You can't do it all. And a lot of the failed and derailed executives I have seen have struggled to get out of that expert trap and elevate their play to be a true leader.
Thanks, Rob.
You know, Jay, I think one thing
sorry,
that
Bill?
one thing that we talk about in leadership development as you're going through, and it's right on what Rob commented about, is that you're not going for 100% with your team of the decision exactly the way you would have done it. You're shooting for an 80%. And if you can get to 80% and it's not going to hurt the company, shut up and let those decisions roll and the team move forward. And so that, I think, is again, being comfortable with a B is okay.
We've had a distinction often between excellence and perfection. You know, and excellence is we won the game. Perfection is when we didn't miss a shot. And so sometimes in the heat of the battle, we're going to miss shots. The goal is to win the game, right? Quick question for the group on communication. So what's the right cadence for leadership to be communicating with their employees more broadly during the or broadly to the broader organization during these times? Any thoughts on what's the right cadence or amount?
Well, it's hard to prescribe one size fits all because obviously everybody has a different situation, that sort of stuff. But the general practice I'm seeing this stuff come down to involves 3 strategies. One is at least one live, usually video chat check-in with the whole team. Not always around an agenda of let's get this work on that work, but there's a lot of checking in and coordinating to make sure we've got alignment. So at least once a week with that one. The other thing I'm seeing, you know, how many times have you been in that meeting that should have been an email? A lot of execs I'm working with are taking that information share, making a real quick 5, maybe 10-minute video where they're actually explaining the message needs to get out, and then either putting it up on the intranet, or, you know, you can post these on almost any video platform, that sort of now, and pushing that link out there to make sure there's the regular flow of information. And then the third strategy is making sure to be extra available in this time for when people need you. Making that okay too. I've seen a lot of folks take the assumption, I know he's got a lot of stuff on him right now, he's really busy, I don't want to bother him. The great executives I'm working with right now are trying to nip that in the bud or head it off at the pass and saying, look, I know this is a strange time. There's lots of barriers and unanticipated things popping up. If you need my counsel, support, ideas, bounce ideas around, I'm available. Those are the 3 channels I'm seeing to make sure we stay on the same page.
Thanks, Rob. Paul or Bill?
C3 as well. I think first I'd observe that I think people who are fearful need more communication, not less. So if you sense they're under stress, you probably want to touch them. The second thing I'd say is look to your tendencies. If you're an introvert, you're probably going to be low in communication, which is fine for the employees who are also that way. But if you're a more outgoing person yourself, you're probably going to overestimate how much you communicate with others, which suggests that, you know, you can scan across your work group, and the right cadence might be fewer contacts for your quiet task type people who may be like you or not, and then more for the social type people who, again, may not be your tendency, but you know that they want to interact more. So maybe use some of that insight as a way to manipulate and adjust to the different groups.
Jay, I would just add, one of the things with the farm credit system that is a strength that I think we could all use even more, but one of the things we've been doing, we've just been reaching out to other association leaders and saying, what are you all doing? And gaining ideas and then providing that. But I think, as Rob and Paul have talked about too, there is an expectation that you do create a cadence with your individual team. When are you going to communicate? How are you going to communicate? Those type of things as goes forward. But the other thing that you can do for your own self-care, because I think Farm Credit as a system is doing pretty well right now in keeping things together. But if you have 10 minutes before you're going to have lunch, or you have 15 minutes before you're going into your next Zoom call, pick up the phone and just call somebody and ask them how they're doing. And use some of those open-ended questions that Rob talked about. But it's just a great way to connect. And I think it will also be a great way for leaders to sustain themselves, because they're going to hear stories about how a team member has went out of their way to get money to a customer, or have helped someone that needed to be home with their kids specifically at a certain time, had another meeting with the school, and they covered for them. Those types of things that I think the system is just really rich with ideas. But I would also say, and one of the things that we've been talking about internal at Mid-America is, if we think we're communicating enough, we're about halfway there. And so I would err on the side of this is one case, more is better.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Bill, and thanks to all three of our panelists. We have, I think we've nailed all the questions. One final note is that we've recorded this, and we can make the slides and the content available to the group, so we'll follow up after that, so you can check in on the content from our discussion. Well, gentlemen, thanks. I know everybody and participants, thanks for taking an hour out of your day to log on, and hopefully we helped share some perspective for you. Gentlemen, I know it took a bit of preparation, and you're busy people. Thanks so much for your insights and taking your time to share them. On behalf of FCC Services and the whole Farm Credit System, thanks to everybody. Stay safe, and we'll be keeping in touch. Take care.